My name is Jeffrey Burke. I'm a boat builder from Tamworth, New Hampshire. I've been boat building since 1982. When I was in second grade, my dad took me on a canoe trip in the Adirondacks here, and we canoed down Long Lake, which is not too far south from here. And we survived a torrential rainstorm that rained so hard that in the middle of the night, a frog jumped into our tent. So we said it rained so hard the frogs had to get out of the rain. And ever since then, canoeing has been very important in my life. In the early 70s, I went to Alaska. My dad was actually originally from Alaska. And in Alaska, I had a job that allowed me to take off summers, and I would take off on canoe trips anywhere from 200 to 1,000 miles. I would take a 17-foot canoe and load it up with my axe, rifle, tent and sleeping bag, and 600 pounds of food, and just disappear on one of the big river systems up there for 2-3 months at a whack. And the 20th century would just go away, and I had just a wonderful, wonderful time, and so on. So I came back east here in the late 70s because my dad had a stroke, and I wanted to be with him. And I had a kind of a crummy, dead-end job. And one day I picked up a copy of Wooden Boat magazine, and there was a picture of a wooden canoe in it, and my brain went click, 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 click. And I realized that all these seemingly disparate skills that I had would be a good foundation for a boat builder. And then I started just reading voraciously, literally every book that's out there on boat building. Some of them I've read 10 or 15 times. And then I started going down East Maine or the coast of Maine, visiting boat shops. And I said to myself, every boat shop I go into, I'm going to learn one thing, even if it's just where they put the pencil sharpener. So I went around and just started talking to people about how do I do this. I'd come in, I'd ask questions that could take somebody a week to answer, like how do you loft, which is how to draw a boat out 3 dimensions full size, and ask, very rank beginner questions, but people were very patient and very helpful. And I built a boat, and somebody saw it and said, I want one. So I got my first order, and I've been off and running ever since. See, in all my years in Alaska, with all these epic canoe trips, I came to appreciate the canoe as something that was not just for, pudding around the pond, but you could take a 1,000-mile trip with and take an epic voyage, really. And so I really came to appreciate the canoe as a craft that was, capable of making these incredible journeys with. And so I have kind of a different relationship to the canoe than a lot of people, because I always think of not how short a trip I can go on, but how long a trip I can go on. Of course, it's well known that the canoe was to the Canada what the covered wagon was the American West. It was how Canada was settled. And it's very interesting that if you look at a map, starting from Montreal, going out around the Great Lakes, and then making a northwesterly kind of slab, is a series that goes right up into the Yukon. There's a series of interconnected lakes that allow you to take off from in a canoe in Montreal and travel all the way to the Arctic Ocean. But what's also interesting and coincident is the fact that paper birch or canoe birch grows along this same swath from eastern Canada right all the way northwesterly up to the Yukon and Northwest Territories. And of course the Northwest, the paper birch was prime material for building the canoe. So the voyageur tradition was just a natural, and they got established, and they used to travel all the way to the mouth of the Mackenzie, which is 3,000 miles in trade and so on and so forth. So the tradition of the canoe is very strongly rooted in Canada, to a lesser degree in the United States. I mean, in that we have places like Maine and New York that have a very strong canoe tradition, but more of a recreational sort. I remember very clearly this time when I saw this picture of this lapstrake canoe. And lapstrake means the planks, they're quarter-inch planks that are overlapped each other, similar to the clapboards on a house. And the most famous lapstrake boats are, of course, the Viking ships that were built 80, 800, 80, 900, and so on. And it's a very interesting idea, because you're taking the Eurasian tradition of lapstrake, or what in Europe is called clinker. You're taking that boat building tradition, and there's a melding together with the North American idea of the canoe, which is uniquely North American, and so on. So they're putting these two traditions together. Now, I saw a picture of this lapstrake boat, and it just went click. It really resonated with me insofar as this is what I wanted to build. And not too far from here, in Canton, New York, there was a fellow whose name was Henry Rushton, and I don't know if you ever heard that name, but Rushton was called the Stradivarius of canoe building. He started building boats in the early 1870s, and he mostly built rowboats. Then, I believe it was in 1883, there was a fellow named whose pen name was Nessmuk, whose real name was George Washington Sears, who wrote Rushton and asked him if he could build as light a canoe as possible. And Nessmuk was this cobbler from Pennsylvania who had the beginning stages of tuberculosis, so he was very weak. He was only about 5'2", weighed 110 pounds, and he wanted a super light boat from Rushton. So Rushton thought about this, and he wound up building a boat that was 9 feet long, weighed 10.5 pounds. And this boat is lapstrake construction, which means cedar planking over an oak ribs, an oak keel. And Nessmuk took this boat. He went on a 300-mile tour with it right here in the Adirondacks, and he actually came right here to Paul Smith's. And he was a very kind of canny guy. He wrote a story about his voyage, which became published in the sporting journal of the day, which was called Forest and Stream. It was the old-time equivalent of Field and Stream or Sports Illustrated. And instantly, overnight in America, the idea of recreational canoeing became the rage. And it's a very interesting point from, let's say, a historical or even a social standpoint, because before this, when people wanted to go out in the woods, they either were professionals, in other words, they were hunters or loggers or something like that, or they were very well heeled and you hired a guide and with your whole entourage. But Nessmuk was this one little guy who just said, I just want to go. And after the American Civil War, you had an emergent middle class who had this phenomena called leisure time and the idea of a vacation. And so when Nessmuk wrote this story about how he toured the Adirondacks in his little canoe, had a great time, and so on, people just were like on that, like, wow, what a good thing to do. So immediately, the orders for canoes, like a tidal wave, just started to flood into Rushton, and for all kinds of boats. And then Rushton also built a sailing canoe that in 1885 won the world championship for canoe sailing. Now the interesting thing is that Nessmuk's original boat is still in existence in the Adirondack Museum. I mean, you can go down there and look at it, and it still weighs 10.5 pounds. But that boat, in a way, you could say, is what really inspired me, because of its lightweight and the fact that it's what you call solid wood. In other words, there's no canvas, there's of course no fiberglass or anything, but I really came to like the idea of using a let's say a Nordic or a Scandinavian technology. As a result of this publicity through Nessmuk's story, Rushton's business just took off, and his book is actually his stories became incorporated in a book, and it's actually still in print, and it's called Woodcraft, and it's just a wonderful read about the Adirondacks and so on. And what's really interesting is that Nessmuk developed this, let's say, group of friends. They were called the Go-Light Brotherhood. And in the 1880s, the kit or the outfit that Nessmuk went out with, including his tent, his sleeping bag, couple days worth of rations, his extra clothes, and his canoe weighed 22 pounds. So Nessmuk really invented this whole idea of ultralight camping gear and the individual going out and by themselves without a guide or so on, and just enjoying the wilderness. So Rushton, of course, made good capital on all this, and his business really took off, and these were called, from a historical perspective, the golden age of canoeing in America. And they were mostly all wood, or what you'd call solid wood boats. They were built lap strake, or some were built smooth skin. But the wood canvas canoe hadn't really come on the scene. That there's a lot of controversy as to where that developed. It obviously is an outgrowth of the birch bark canoe because they're similar in structure. But some say it started in Canada. Some people say it started in Maine. But I believe around 1890, Rushton invited or hired a fellow from Maine who knew how to build wood canvas boats, and in time that became the mainstay of his shop. Although Rushton made the analogy of comparing a wood canvas boat to a canvas tent versus a brownstone home. He always preferred the solid wood boats, but a solid wood boat is 4 or 5 times more labor to build, and has a higher, and this is, I'm probably going to get punched for saying this, but it just has a different or higher or more demanding skill level than wood canvas. But just by the fact it was so much cheaper to produce, and it was conducive, the wood canvas boat, and it was conducive to having a factory setup. He kept the cost really low. And as I said earlier, there was this whole emergent middle class with the idea of leisure time, and what's the best way to take a cheap vacation is go canoeing, because you don't have any camping fees or car fees or anything like that. And so that really took off. And then what it was actually ellipsed by was the popularity of the bicycle. And then, of course, after the bicycle, the automobile came on the scene, and it was, just kind of morphed into all that, the way Americans spent their recreational time. With solid wood boats, there's a lot of what you'd call wood-to-wood joinery, in that the watertight integrity of the hull is directly dependent upon the quality of the joiner work. I'll have a plank that will come in like this, and then I'll have another plank that will come in on an angle, and I need to cut a bevel along here that is watertight. To do this, the tool I use the most is just a small little common block plane. But like my own personal block plane has been, has a aftermarket blade in it of really good steel, and it's been tuned up, so it's just very accurate and very precision. But it's actually quite remarkable how easy it is to do, because there's ways that you can sight this bevel as you're doing it that exaggerates any irregularities. And so it's like looking at some fine print with a big magnifying glass, you can really see where there are problems, what I call humps, bumps, or wows, that are going to not allow the wood to come together. And so you can just tune it up a little bit more, and then you make a joint that put together is watertight. And it like, there were many boats built like this. One old boat builder said that if you don't put anything in a joint, you don't have to worry about anything coming out, because one of my most common questions asked is, do you glue the joint, or what do you put in the joint to keep it watertight? And first of all, if you glue the joint, the boat will tear itself apart, because if you have 7 planks per side, when that boat goes from dry to wet, those planks all move a tiny little bit. It might only be a 64th of an inch, but so there's a little bit of slippage between the planks. If they're all glued together, all of that slippage would build up to maybe a 1/4 of an inch, that the boat just wouldn't have anywhere to go, and so something would break or something would crack. And so if you do put anything in the joints, you want to put something that is flexible. But the second consideration is that any bedding compound after 20 or 30 years is going to be shot. It's just going to oxidize, and either they get hard and brittle, or it gets to be like ashes in there a little bit, kind of dusty, crackly, and it also loses its watertight integrity. So there really is something to, when you build what we call solid wood, of just laying up all your joints wood to wood without any goop in there. What we call goop is a term for any type of bedding compound, because it's kind of just the best way to do it. But a lot of people feel like they don't trust their joiner work, and they need to put something in there, and you can do that, and it works fine. But I've come to feel that the best way is just to do it wood to wood. Well, one of the key, in fact, if not the most key, insofar as important elements of Rushton's success and my own success and my love of doing this trade, is the materials that we have here. Now, Rushton, as well as myself, could use exclusively local materials, because here in northern New York and northern New England, you have some of the very best boat building woods in the world. And at the top of the heap, we have this material called northern white cedar, or arborvitae, which in the cedars, there's a half a dozen different cedars in the United States. It's far and away in a class unto itself insofar as being a superior product. And it's what enabled Rushton to build this boat, Serigamp, at only 10.5 pounds, but the guy could take it for a 300-mile journey, is the toughness and what I would describe as the ductileness of the cedar, where it gets a little bit of moisture in it and it almost becomes leathery. And it is really amazing how it's just like the perfect material for the job. So Rushton, of course, could build truly a world-class product just using local materials. Some of the other materials he used were oak, and as I use a lot of oak as well, but one of the things that I've learned through boat building is that even within a species, there's a wide range that, for lack of a better word, of personalities. And this has been scientifically quantified, and the term is variability within a species. And what I mean is that you can have a tree that grows in one location, and it's got good water, good soil, lots of sunlight, and the wood in that the wood from that tree in that location will be very different from a tree growing someplace where it didn't get enough sun and it really had to struggle and so on. And the difference in oak can be up to 50% difference in the strength. And so I find when I buy wood, I just don't go into a lumber yard and buy wood. I usually find a logger who's on a lot that has some good wood, and I like to go right out and look at each individual tree, because I like to look at the trunk of the tree, or what they call the stem, and you look at the bark for the coloration, because that's indicative of how the tree is growing and the health. And then you look at the top of the tree, or what's called the crown. And if you have a little small crown, even though you have a nice straight trunk, it means the tree is growing relatively slowly, and your growth rings are going to be close together, which makes a wood that is hard, heavy, but brittle. And amongst the hardwoods, what you want to look for is what I describe as a young, athletic, adolescent tree, something that's just really going for it and growing well and is rigorous and so on. But the other thing that's really interesting is that there are other environmental factors that come into play here. Like, I got a bunch of oak once that was from Indiana. And you think Indiana, they got a good, long, hot summer. They grow corn like crazy. It's rich soil. This wood would be just wonderful. Well, I found it to be brittle and tended to shatter when it broke. Whereas the same species of tree, right from locally where I am in New Hampshire, which is mountainous, lot of wind, long, tough winters, was very, very different. And when you broke it, it was very begrudging, and it was just stringy, gnarly, tough wood versus this, fat farm boy Indiana wood. And I mean, it had life too easy for it. And so you realize that all these different woods have personality. And there's some wood that is just sweet disposition, and there's some wood that's crabby and just, you have to fuss. It's high maintenance. You have to be really careful not to split it and so on. So it's really kind of cool. But the interesting thing that happens, though, is in a boat, like one of these little Russian canoes, you have about a half a dozen different species of wood that you use for various components because of their characteristics insofar as weight or strength and so on and so forth. Like Rushton used on the Surrey Gamp, he used oak for both the keel and the ribs. He also sometimes framed his boats out in red elm, which is very tough, but it doesn't have the rot resistance of oak. For stems, he would often make a steam bent stem where he would take a piece of oak and boil it and then bend it around a form, or he would dig a tamarack knee, which means he would dig out the root of a tree from the ground and get a piece of wood that had a nice curve in the grain and use that for the stem. I do a lot of the same thing as well. This is also the way the Adirondack guide boat is done. It's framed up with what you call grown knees or sawn frames, where they take spruce roots and do the same thing. But this part of the world is very, very special because, as I mentioned before, you can make a truly world-class product with just the local woods. And it's one of the very best places you can be on this planet for growing, for building boats like this. But my tools are really pretty simple. I mean, in that I mentioned I use the block plane a lot. The other tool that I use a lot is a 2-inch chisel, which is just a chisel. It's maybe about this long with a handle on it, and it's been very carefully sharpened. And you use it mostly for paring. And paring means that you're always just pushing it. You're never striking it with a mallet like you would if you're doing mortise work. Like if you're doing a timber frame construction, you have to cut mortises and tenons, and you have the same chisel, but you have a big heavy handle on it, and you have a big mallet, and you're bang, bang, banging it. So this same 2-inch chisel that you can use in timber frame construction, it's about 12 to 14 inches long with about an 8-inch blade, can be sharpened at a much lower angle, so it's really used for what you call a paring cut, which means to push everything by hand. And if you go into the Adirondack Museum, they have on display there in a glass case a 2-inch chisel that belonged to a Mr. Grant, who is one of the most well-known guide boat builders. And in building boats, whether it's canoes or the guide boat, the 2-inch chisel is like the tool to use, and you use it for roughing out laps, for cutting scarfs, and cutting what you call gains, which is part of the lap, and so on. It's just a really very versatile tool. Now, the interesting thing is that when I teach my classes, I'll have 8 or 10 students, and one of the first things I show them when they come in is my 2-inch chisels, and I usually come to class with 4 or 5 of them that have all been tuned up. And they mean sharpened to the umpteenth degree. They have really nice handles on them, and so on and so forth. And people look at me like, geez, this guy's a little odd. Well, I might be, but they don't really understand how you use this tool. And I start to show them some simple moves at how to cut these certain things, whether it's a scarf joint or a gain. And people look at it and go, that's easy to do, and then they start to do it. And they initially start off with a tedious frown on their face. But as they do it and they do it and they do it, and their hands learn to do it, usually within about a day or so, the frown turns to a smile, where they're really, it's kind of like that moment when you learn to ride a bicycle, where all of a sudden it goes click, and the tool becomes an extension of your body. And what's really interesting is the fact that this tool, the 2-inch chisel, becomes the most used tool going in the building of whether it's a lap straight canoe or a guide boat. And it's a very, very simple tool. And by the end of the class, everybody in the class is trying to buy my collection. And of course, they're my own personal use. And the unfortunate thing, though, is that there is nobody in the world who is making a proper 2-inch chisel for this kind of use. The irony is that 100 years ago they were commonplace. So what we do is I buy every used 2-inch chisel I can, and I refurbish them, and I do sell them to my students at a reasonable price. But this is one tool that was so important that in Grant's guide boat shop, he described it as the most important tool in the shop, and he kept it in a secret drawer to prevent, quote, borrowing of the chisel, because this one, and I have discovered too that this one tool is a very simple tool. So we have the block plane, the 2-inch chisel, and the other tools that I use, of course, are a drill and a screwdriver, and then I have, of course, a bandsaw and a planer, which is really much all you need so far as power equipment is concerned. But you know, really relatively simple tools, but just used to a high degree of finesse. And it's really interesting though, because so many people don't build boats like this because they don't kind of get it so far as developing the skill with a 2-inch chisel. But it's the kind of thing where you just have to get over that threshold, as it is whether you're knitting or anything. You just have to learn the basics and get the hand-eye coordination down, and then it opens up a whole nother world for you. The axe has always been one of my favorite tools, and what's interesting is that in Scandinavia, if you look in a carpenter's toolbox, you'll find the usual carpenter's tools of a hammer and a saw and a few chisels and pencil and compass, but you also will find an axe. And in Scandinavia, they use the axe the same way that we use as a chisel or a saw and so on, where they often will hold the axe like this, and you can make very controlled paring cuts with it. And I sometimes do this, but the other thing that I do is I use this when I have a lot of wood to remove, like from a keel. I'll take the axe and I make a series of small chops, which is called fish scaling. You're just making chops like every half an inch right up and down where you want to remove the wood. Then you can take the axe and you just go and you just shave off all the wood that's already been what you call scored or fish scaling, because it looks like the scales on a fish. And this is really the only way you can effectively remove large amounts of wood without power tools. What a lot of people would do today is, of course, use a router, or they would use abrasives and just grind it all off, which makes a huge mess and so on. So I find I use the axe as a lot in doing things like this. But the axe for me personally is a tool, a very important tool in what you call bushcraft, meaning that when you were when I was going out on these long trips in Alaska, I always had an axe with me, and I used it just for everything from opening a can of beans to building a fire, or helping somebody build a cabin, and so on and so forth. And here in the Adirondacks, it said if you took an experienced woodsman and asked him to go spend the night in the woods and offered him either a box of matches or an axe, and he can only pick one, he would pick the axe, because it's just, you can do so much more with it. But I could talk a long time about the axe. I mean, we could do a whole nother video on that. It was said to me that in the early 50s, the newly emergent petrochemical industry did a very good job brainwashing the American public to think that plastic is the answer. And I have at home a boat, a lap straight boat, that was built in Canton, New York. We're just not that far from here. That is 125 years old, and it is in perfect structural condition. It's had a lot of use. I've paddled it a lot, and it's just fine. And it's I can say it's as strong as a fiberglass boat, but a different way. It has a different kind of strength. Like, it doesn't like to be drug across a rocky beach. It likes to get picked up. It doesn't like to be left out in the sun day in, day out. It's really more like having a plant, because it is a plant product. There's a few basic things that it wants to be, you want to be aware of. And you could say that there's some people who shouldn't have a pet because they would forget to feed it, or they forget to, give it water or something like that. And it's the same way with wooden boats. And I recognize not everybody should have a wooden boat, because there is a little bit of care that it needs, but it doesn't need a tremendous amount, but it does need that little bit of care. So I'm fine if somebody says, what about maintenance? That's a big headache for me. No problem. I have no problem recommending to somebody else, another builder, to get a composite boat or a synthetic boat and so on. But I've come to realize it's really a personal responsibility thing, where either you want to be in we live in a throwaway society where we just toss it, or you learn to cultivate the ethic of care and responsibility. And to digress briefly is to say that the best things in life, whether it's your family or your marriage or your planet or your garden, take care and maintenance. And so I just, myself, I've transferred that to being just responsible boats. And somebody, because you see this, people come up to you at a boat show and they look at your boat and go, oh, this is so beautiful and so on. And then they kind of look around a little and they go, your lip starts to quiver a little bit. What about maintenance? And like, this is the big boogeyman. And I just say, maintenance takes 4 to 6 hours a year. And if you can't do that, you really shouldn't have a wooden boat, which is fine. It's not for everybody. But it doesn't bother me. I look at it as an opportunity, let's say, just to to be responsible. I have found that there's no hard and fast rule so far as who my customers might be. My boats are not inexpensive, but if you were really into playing the violin, you would save every nickel you had just to get the best violin you possibly could because of the quality of sound. And what I find for me is very special about using these boats is, I guess, what you would call their aesthetic purity. And I find that when I'm out in some beautiful natural environment like we have right out here, to be sitting on a piece of metamorphized dinosaur, which is basically a petrochemical product, it doesn't contribute to, let's say, the aesthetic experience. And for me personally, to be out in a wooden boat in a beautiful natural environment is really a peak experience. I feel a profound connection with the earth. It makes me feel euphoric. And I am a person of aesthetic sensitivities. Not everybody is like that. Some people are very performance oriented and so on and so forth. But I also am convinced that one of the things that I find is I like to build boats that are really good performers, in that they tend to be fast and they tend to be seaworthy. But the boat, a canoe, is, it's, for a lot of people, it becomes a very special inanimate object. It becomes really a friend and so on. And I found on these long canoe trips I used to do, your life depended upon that canoe. And like, for instance, whenever you pulled up at night, you made real sure your boat was always well secured, tied up, because if that thing was gone, you were toast. And so you really have this respect. It's an essential article. I think most of America would say the same thing about the automobile, but I just find that the traveling by canoe is just so aesthetically pleasing, and it's very environmentally sensitive. You're not using any petrochemical products, and it's really like a symphony because you have this local product, local wood, handcrafted, and it just comes together, and it's a unique aesthetic experience. There's a boat builder on the coast of Maine whose name is Walt Simmons. The name of his business is Duck Trap Woodworking. And after I saw the picture of the canoe in the magazine that made my brain go click, 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 I found out about Walt, and he had been a lapstrake boat builder for a number of years, and we started corresponding. And he was an amazing guy because he's the type of person that is gruff. He doesn't necessarily suffer fools well, and his attitude is, if you can't figure it out, you can't build the boat. But I have at home a sheaf of letters from him about this thick of him answering the most mundane, I realize now, idiotic questions from a beginning, a fledgling boat builder. And he was very patient and very kind. And so he had a tremendous influence. I've built a whole bunch of his boats. We're now good friends, and we go back and forth as colleagues, but he was really my chief mentor. And he had, midpoint in his career, kind of just discovered the so-called Rushton canoe. I started my career with a Rushton canoe. And then amongst the WCHA here, we have Pam Wedd, who is from Parry Sound, Ontario, Bear Wood Canoe, and she builds wood canvas, but just does such a superb job with her craftsmanship and the choice of her materials. Her finishing work is out of this world. I mean, it's just amazing that, makes me look kind of like a hack. But she's really an inspiration just because of her meticulousness and so on. But she's actually been coming to my shop to visit and spend time just because she's interested in doing lapstrake or clinker or solid wood. She's built a lot of wood canvas, and so there's a lot of back and forth, let's say cross-pollination going on, which is great. And I myself one of my big things is, like when I teach, I love to see these boats built. I love to get people enthusiastic about them and really get going, wow, this is amazing. In fact, I'm actually negotiating, or going to enter into negotiations here with Paul Smith's to get a boat building program going, because I mean, this right here is where this all started. This was Nessmuk's country, and Rushton was right over here, but nobody around here is building boats like this. So I'm hopeful to do that. But there are some really talented people out there who I feel, I don't look at them as competitors. Boat builders tend to be a very individualistic lot, you know, crusty, do it my way, but there's a very strong camaraderie, and the attitude professionally is, I'll do anything I can to help you out. And it's really, really nice. And I mean, this was shown to me when Walt just made all this correspondence to me, because I was sincere. I was a little bit goofy, but I was sincere in this endeavor. And it's really, really great how much boat builders help each other out. I first joined the Wooden Canoe Heritage Association in 1982, and now we've kind of come full circle in that I became a board member, and then for a while I was the president of the organization, and I found that I'm not good at politics, and now I am, you know, just a member. But my wife Annie is the executive director, you know, which is a part-time salaried position, and it has been really great. I've made tons of really great friends. We all share a vision of beauty and aesthetic value. And what I found is that when you take a bunch of people and you put them together doing something they love, everybody is happy. And it's so I've come to feel like that everybody should have at least 2 wooden canoes in their garage. There'd be a lot less crabbing on this planet, because when people really do something that they love and put their hearts into it, they, like, whatever you want to call it, they self-actualize or whatever, but they're following their heart, and people are happy. Then they're interested. And what's really interesting about this meet here is so much of what's going on. There's the history aspect of it and technique aspect of it, but there is more than I think anything else is the appreciation of beauty, where people are walking around and looking at this boat and admiring the paint job, or that line is very pretty, and it's just, I don't know how else to say it, but it's good for your heart. It's good for your outlook of the world. It's good for humanity, and that's why I think this is just such a healthy thing to do. And in consequence, I'm very enthusiastic about the WCHA. I mean, I just feel like everybody should have a canoe, especially if they're all lap strike.